Now, ever since the advent of humanity, we've been entirely reliant on technology. And in fact, without it, our species would be quite useless. Just imagine how many winters we'd survive without warm clothing, or how we'd fare in a fist fight against a bear. Now, throughout the last 200 years or so, after the Industrial Revolution, technology has grown leaps and bounds, with entirely new, unimaginable things suddenly becoming possible. To show this, let me start you out on this. This is the USS President. Launched in 1800, this sailing vessel could cross the Atlantic Ocean in about 30 days, with conditions on board being anything but comfortable. You would live in a dark space below deck, with dim oil lamps lighting your way, and live in subjectivity to wind and weather in what was an incredibly perilous journey that was oftentimes lethal. If we jump only 56 years into the future, we can see the advent of the steam engine. This is one of the first transatlantic ocean liners, purpose-built with communal spaces on board, cabin classes, and through its motorization, capable of crossing the ocean in only about 10 days. If we make the same jump again, we are now in 1912, the golden age of ocean liners, and we have now made it to a point where behemoth ships of Herculean proportions, 45,000 tons in weight, are shipping across the Atlantic in only 5 days, with amenities that you'd expect of a luxury hotel, like spas, a la carte restaurants, and all kinds of communal gathering spaces. If we make that same jump again, however, something changes. The ships are gone. In the same time period it took us to go from sailing vessels to steam engines, and from steam engines to more refined steam engines, we have conquered air travel. What happened in that time for such a humongous change to take place? Well, the easy answer is 2 world wars and a major reformation. But there is also quite a longer answer. If we now make this jump one last time, we can see that we are now in 2024. Now, not really a lot has changed since then, superficially. If you look at this aircraft, this is a Boeing 787, it doesn't seem to be all that different from what we just saw on the last slide. The 5-hour flight time across the Atlantic hasn't really changed all that much. And so we find ourselves with increased fuel efficiency, but not really with a lot of advancement. While we find ourselves in an era of a lot of technological achievements, like permanent manned space stations, like satellites and global positioning systems, transatlantic undersea cables and personal computers giving us access to information readily wherever we want, we cannot help but recognize that these are not particular products of modernity. The Navstar GPS system was introduced in 1973 by the US to locate submarines with nuclear bombs on board. In 1983, the first personal computers surfaced. Transatlantic telegraph wires have been around since about the mid-19th century, and the ISS was instated in 1998. Now this brings us to something I like to call the developmental sigmoid curve. This graphs what development and the speed of development has looked like ever since the Industrial Revolution. We can see a stark increase in the speed of development, culminating in about the 60s and 70s, with us slowing down in modernity once more. If we look at the peak time, we can see that a lot of technological marvels were achieved around this time period. If we look, for example, at 1968, where, as shown, we have seen the Boeing 747, to this day, one of the most ubiquitous long-haul jets. Only 1 year later, the first man set foot on the moon in the US spacecraft. And in the same year, the first supersonic passenger airliner was introduced. If we go back to the curve itself, we can see that a lot of events that have contributed heavily to what we as a Western capitalist society have based our beliefs upon happened in this very time frame. In the time frame where technological advancement was at its fastest. This includes things like World War I, the Roaring Twenties, World War II, and the Cold War. But then why are we starting to see this slowdown? Well, there are a lot of complex reasons for this, but going into three will have to suffice. Economic downturn, misperception, and intangibility. By economic downturn, we can examine crises over the latter half of the 20th century, along with the restructuring of global markets due to economic globalization. We can also look at high inflation, which was partly caused by, of course, the economy restructuring, but partly caused by cataclysmic events and energy crises. Climate change has also played a big part in this, as regulation by governments has caused innovation to become increasingly difficult and has caused business costs to increase, further driving inflation as well. Supply chains have also been shocked by extreme weather events that result from this. This is compounded by major events like, for example, the 2008 financial crisis, which also has part to play in what our economy is like today. With misperception, we have two sides to the coin. The unintentional misperception is what we saw throughout the 20th century in forms of the First and Second World War, where major advancements in technology on the military front were made in armored vehicles, aviation, submarine navigation, all of these things advancing at neck-breaking speeds. And after the Second World War, we could see how much we had gained. Jet engine technology, nuclear fission, be it weaponized or not, submarines, all of these things that were later used for civilian applications and therefore contributed to society's welfare. There's also intentional misperception, which most prominently was present in the Cold War, where both the USSR and the US had major stakes in shrouding what their actual capabilities were like, overstating them often. A prominent example of this is the space race, where we can see on the USSR side, Yuri Gagarin, first man in space, or over on the US's side, the Apollo 11 mission, putting men on the moon. Now, a lesser known example, but one that fits the bill quite perfectly, is the example of the MiG-25. The MiG-25 was a fighter jet designed by the USSR, a heavy interceptor. When the US first got its eyes on it, they were frightened. They thought the large wings and powerful engines, which could propel the aircraft above Mach 3.1, would shoot down their supersonic bombers at a moment's notice, and scrambled to produce an answer. They had no aircraft like it, so they developed the F-15 Eagle. Now, in 1976, Viktor Belenko, a Russian pilot of a MiG-25, defected to the US by landing one of these aircraft in Japan. And when the US authorities got their hands on it, they saw that it wasn't really anything impressive at all. It was made out of cheap materials, which were heavy, causing it to require large wings to even get off the ground. Its engines were powerful and did bring it up to Mach 3.1, but if maintained there for a longer flight period, they would simply overheat and melt. The radar technology was old and couldn't face downwards, and the pilot's visibility was majorly impaired. The F-15 Eagle, in comparison, soared overhead and beat out almost every Soviet aircraft for the following half-century. Lastly, intangibility. Intangibility is all around us today. Even our most basic devices feature billions of transistors, and what is shown above is the IBM 2nm transistor, which was only developed a couple of months back, and which consists of a silicon body that is only about 20 atoms wide. So small that the manufacturing process requires modulated beams of light to cut the transistors in order for the oscillating wavelengths not to cut into the shape. Things like the Large Hadron Collider as well are used for highly specific scientific research that daily people are less likely to understand than something like, say, a faster aircraft or a bigger ship. I also want to come back to the example of the 787 we had previously, because there were some parts I didn't mention. They were a bit more specialized, but they do play into what the aircraft is. It was one of the first aircraft with a full composite body, giving it superior flight characteristics, as well as wing flexibility. The GEnx engines are highly fuel efficient and produce enough electricity to use a non-bleed air electric leading edge heating system, which allows for de-icing at airports to be completely negated. Also, the composite body strength has allowed for larger windows in the aircraft's hull and for a higher cabin pressure, increasing passenger comfort. So how does this affect our society? Well, in the time period shown before, where technological progress was at its fastest, we could see many of the ideals in emerging, which we still see today to some extent. Things like the American dream of a nuclear family, of which parts have subsisted. This is also shown by things like ocean liners as well. What you can see there is the SS United States, to this day the fastest ocean liner ever built, and the pride of our nation. So, what are the effects of seeing this infatuation with technology fading and slowing away? Well, for one, data has suggested that especially younger people in the US and in the West are suffering high rates of depression, which can be correlated to a feeling of purposelessness. This has also led to greater division when it comes to politics and conflicts on a global and intra-state scale, which is characterized by an increase in the amount of political movements. And this has also inherently led to an increased propensity for political extremism, which provides something for people to believe in, be it very, very extreme, but infatuating, something that can bring that purpose to someone. There's also a corporate symptom to all this. Companies have always been good at recognizing what people feel and exploiting it for their own good. A prime example of this is Elon Musk. Elon Musk doesn't really sell his products, he sells the future. Things like his SpaceX program, his ambitious Mars exploration, and his robots and Neuralinks all play into the marketing that he is advancing humanity. This plays into the sales for companies like Tesla, where projects that are essentially marketing stunts, like the here shown Las Vegas loop, emerge. The Las Vegas loop's idea is that a Tesla will carry you autonomously from station to station in a tube system below Las Vegas. Now, while this looks impressive and futuristic, if you think about it in logistical terms, it has no application whatsoever. Because the same amount of infrastructure is needed as for a traditional subway system, which could transport hundreds of people per train instead of simply 4 or 5. Another symptom of this is the Virgin Hyperloop, something that was all over the news for the longest time, but has since died away. A quick consideration to maintaining long-range tubes of vacuum-maintained tubing is just preposterous. It couldn't be done with any amount of maintenance. The amount of startups over time has also increased, pitching increasingly outlandish and futuristic ideas, thinking that they may revolutionize some sort of an industry. But in reality, most of these ideas have no merit at all. They simply bank on looking futuristic. This brings us to a takeaway. Our society has banked on technology for much of what it stands for. And in today's world, with this slowly dying away, we can see symptoms of what this does to us. We can see increasing atomization, individualistic traits. We can see our societal homogenization and our unities within our countries breaking apart. People becoming more lonely, people feeling purposeless. If we want to change this trend, we need to recognize it, and we need to find our way to other things that matter as well, like feelings of community, or family, something that Eastern countries seem to have been quite a bit better at in the West. But if we are to change this trend, and if we are to save ourselves from the exploitation of corporations and infatuating politicians with ulterior motives, then we must first see that this is happening, and I hope that some of you do. Thank you very much.